Well, we are going to return this morning to the book of Ecclesiastes and begin in Ecclesiastes Chapter 2. If you read through the book of Job, I know I just said Ecclesiastes and that's what I meant, but if you read through the book of Job, you'll notice what scholars would like to call a hermeneutical principle. That just means a way of looking at the book, a specific study aspect that needs to be added to studying the book of Job as you pay attention to the arguments from Job's friends. Now, if you've ever read the book of Job, and I hope all of you have, I think you have, I hope you've read the book of Job, and you'll notice there are some things that Job's friends say that seem right, but maybe feel wrong. Or put it the other way, maybe they feel right and seem wrong. And sometimes you read what Job's friends are saying and you're nodding. But then if you're really careful and you read some of the things they say, you think, that's not the way I've thought of this before. Well, it's not until you get to the end of the book of Job, in fact, in Job chapter 42, verse 7, that you read this quote. It came about after the Lord had spoken these words to Job that the Lord said to Eliphaz the Temanite, that was one of Job's buddies, "My wrath is kindled against you and against your two friends because you have not spoken of me what is right as my servant Job has." There's the principle for reading the book of Job and realizing that every time Job's friends talk, they might be off by a degree or two. Now, it's one thing to note when you're off by a degree and you're only moving a few inches. But if you're off by a degree and you're traveling 1,000 miles, you're going to be very far off of the intended course. How many of us have tried to hang a shelf in a house only to find that maybe that wall is not quite at a 90-degree angle to the other one? Suddenly, that close-fitting shelf that you thought that you were cutting must be modified. Maybe we'll just have to sand that in at an angle or something like that. And that's exactly, I think, what we're seeing in the book of Job. And the same thing that gives us the same principle for framing the book of Job happens in the book of Ecclesiastes. In the book of Ecclesiastes, as we open up the very beginning, in Ecclesiastes 1 through 11, we get the framework, or at least the first few verses, we get the framework of the author, the compiler, the guy who sat down with all of the notes of this fellow named the teacher, or Koheleth, and he took all of these notes, or all of this teaching, and he began to assemble them. And then we get to the end of the book, in Ecclesiastes 12, 8 through 15, and we find that secondary framing that the best that we can do is to fear God and honor Him. We'll go to a direct quotation later, but we find out then that we have something framing the book of Ecclesiastes as we read it that should help us to interpret the writings or the speakings of this fellow by the name of Koheleth. And it frames us it gives us an understanding to say that not everything Koheleth says is correct. But I tell you what, from our perspective, as we're living on the same planet that he was living on, it seems pretty accurate. So we just have to read Koheleth, I guess maybe with an extra eye open to the end of the book, recognizing that maybe what he says is missing an ingredient. Maybe he's just a degree off, or maybe he's 0.3 of a degree off that's going to lead him in the wrong direction, or maybe we need to be aware of that. Well, in chapter 2, in chapter 1, he says, everything is vanity. It's like grasping smoke, or I guess the illustration that stuck is it's like nailing Jell-O to the wall. You can't quite wrap your hands around life and say, here's the rules by which life operates. And moreover, he has a couple of phrases, and we're going to deal with all three of them, or at least the first three, that seem to be repeated throughout the book. Of course, the primary one that we're all used to is Vanity of Vanities. Everything is vanity. Meaningless, or how about unsatisfactory? You could come up with lots of different words that kind of plug in there. Insufficient is the one that I have scribed on the edge of my Bible, because I feel like that's kind of capturing what he's struggling with. As all this stuff is just not right. It's not enough. It's the wrong thing. It's the wrong conclusion. It's insufficient. It doesn't give me a handle that I can hang from for long. Well, in chapter 1, he's frustrated that there's in verse 3, no advantage in all of the things we have. And he's going to have that idea of advantage or profit, same word, coming up again and again and again in the book. So everything is meaningless, or everything is unsatisfactory, and then there's really no eternal, lasting, good benefit. And then he's going to come up with another one, and we'll see where we find it as we go through the chapter. And I think we can break up the chapter in about 4 different blocks. And so if we take verses 1 through 11, chapter 2, verses 1 through 11, it's about physical pleasure. And chapters 12 through 17 turns to contemplate the satisfying thought life. And then chapters 18 to 23, he contemplates the gathering of wealth. And then at the very end, he kind of summarizes his findings. So that's kind of the map if you read through chapter 2. So let's just begin with his conclusion in the first 11 verses, and that's that physical pleasure is havel. It's empty. It's unsatisfactory. It's insufficient. It's vanity. It's like grabbing smoke. And essentially, here's another phrase for you: hedonism doesn't work. And what is hedonism? That's another one of those weird words Pastor likes to use sometimes. But for Koheleth, the only way to find out, and we'll get into that, the only way to find out is to try it. See if you like it. See if everything you've ever wanted is the answer to everything you've ever needed. And I think, man, he was living the American dream before America ever entered into anybody's brain. And I find it intriguing that Koheleth, in the midst of his discussions, he doesn't deny that God exists. And I think we need to hang on to that with the recognition. You know, you open up the book of Romans, and the problem, Paul says, the indictment against humanity is that they knew God, but at the same time, they didn't want to, and so they kind of suppressed that knowledge. They actually suppressed that knowledge, and then just kind of live life without Him. And Koheleth is kind of doing that. He knows God is there, and he's not real happy about it. And then he, knowing that God is there, tries to not factor God into any of his conclusions. And so he's trying, from the standpoint of somebody whose feet are firmly planted on the earth, to make sense of the entirety of all that life is without any reference to God. And I think, man, how contemporary can you get? This is our entire society. And so he just begins. Let's read those first 11 verses here. I said to myself, come now, I will test you with pleasure. Talking to himself. Ooh, we are about, he says, to have a good time. So enjoy yourself. And behold, it too was futility. That's havel. I said of laughter, it's madness, and of pleasure, what does it accomplish? So this is where he begins. Let's just let's go ahead and finish reading it. I explored with my mind how to stimulate my body with wine while my mind was guiding me wisely, and how to take hold of folly until I could see what good there is, what profit there is for the sons of men to do under heaven the few years of their lives. I enlarged my works. I built houses for myself. I planted vineyards for myself. I made gardens and parks for myself, and I planted them all kinds of fruit trees. I made ponds of water for myself from which to irrigate the forest of growing trees. I bought male and female slaves, and I had homeborn slaves, and I possessed flocks and herds larger than all who preceded me in Jerusalem. And I collected for myself silver and gold and the treasure of kings and provinces. I provided for myself male and female singers and the pleasures of men, many concubines. And then I became great and increased more than all who preceded me in Jerusalem. My wisdom also stood by me. All that my eyes desired, here's the golden mark, all that my eyes desired, I did not refuse them. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure, for my heart was pleased because of all my labor, and this was my reward for all my labor. Thus, I considered all my activities with my hands had done, and the labor which I had exerted, and behold, it was all vanity, striving after wind, and there was no profit under the sun. Hedonism doesn't work. I could go and do this. Hedonism, by the way, just a simple definition that I grew up with is hedonism is if it feels good, do it. And this is exactly what Koheleth does in the first 11 verses. Anything my heart desired. I saw it, I wanted it, I got it. It didn't matter what it was. If it was a thing you could buy, I bought it. If it was a thing you could use, I used it. If it was a thing you could take, I took it. If it was a thing you could have, I had it. He tests himself with pleasure. John Piper writes in his book, Desiring God. This is the class. If you've never read John Piper, this is the book to read for John Piper. Desiring God, Meditations of a Christian Hedonist. And the title is a bit provocative because hedonism is not normally associated with Christianity. If it feels good, do it. But John Piper says that's the point. And so if I could summarize him, he says the problem isn't that we humans pursue pleasure. Pleasure exists. By the way, can I just point out that God created pleasure? I think that's worth pointing out. God created pleasure. He's not some celestial killjoy who wants us to be miserable, and that's why he gave us all these laws. No, he created pleasure, and he actually knows how it's supposed to work. He knows that Koheleth is trying to build this furniture without the instruction manual. And that's the problem that Koheleth keeps running into. Anyhow, back to John Piper, he says that experiencing God, that encountering God is the greatest possible pleasure we can encounter. And that a wise person, or a wise Christian would make the pursuit of the pleasure of God their greatest possible emphasis in their lives, because it's only when we are most satisfied in Him that He's most glorified in us. In other words, you're never going to feel better than when you're fully in God's presence. So why would you settle for less? Be a hedonist as a Christian, pursuing God. And I have to appreciate John Piper's take on that. Koheleth did not get the advanced copy of the book. That was the problem. His first verse summarizes it. It's all futility. Laughter, he says, is madness. It carries, of course, the idea of a good time. We all like to laugh. But what happens when you've heard a couple of good jokes? It's funny the first time. You might even chuckle the second time. If it's a really good joke, you might chuckle the fifth time. But you know what? It runs out pretty quick, doesn't it? It's like having the toddler say the same thing over and over and over and over and over. You want me to quit? Over and over again. Hey, Dad. 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 Guess what? We've all done it. Hey, Uncle. Hey, Uncle. Hey, Uncle. What? Because that which starts out really cute becomes really irritating really fast. Because that which is pleasurable in a moment certainly loses its luster. So he says, well, here, let me check it out. Let's try booze. I'm going to get, there's some discussion here in the commentaries. Is he talking about being a wine connoisseur? A sommelier, I think is the word, sommelier. Is he talking about being a sommelier, where he's just really fancy about wine? Or is he talking about dallying with drunkenness, but not quite losing the buzz? You know what I'm saying? I think it's the second one. I think he's playing around with how drunk can I get without losing my brain and still be able to think about it. How do I get the buzz, but not fall over and bang my head? Is this kind of what he's looking for? In other words, I'm going to test out alcohol and see if in the midst of this thing that's fun, I can find purpose. Well, it doesn't work. He says, I explored with my mind how to stimulate. Did I have that up there? Oh, yeah. I explored with my mind how to stimulate my body with wine until, while my mind was guiding me wisely, how to take hold of folly until I could see what good there is for the sons of men to do under heaven for the few years of their lives. You see how in the few years of their lives, he's still stuck on his conclusion in chapter 1. Life is so brief and meaningless. So he's still holding on to his former conclusion. So can I drink without mind-numbing drunkenness and in that find satisfaction? No. The answer is ultimately, it doesn't work. It's folly. He drinks and tries to stay in control. He wasn't looking for blackouts just to maintain the buzz. And in the end, he discovers that even this very popular pastime leaves everything to be desired. It's not enough. You know what? In fact, I would suspect, he doesn't go into detail here, but I would suspect he discovers the same thing that we all discover. What started out with one drink being good, soon it takes 4 or 6 or 7 or 10 to get the same effect. And the same thing happens in almost every arena of life. What used to take just one takes several. So that doesn't work. So what about the accumulation of luxury? The American dream. All I want is 75 acres and stuff to do with it, right? All I want is everything. Ecclesiastes 2, Verses 4 through 6, I enlarged my works. I built houses for myself. I planted vineyards for myself. I made gardens and parks and planted them with all kinds of fruit trees and ponds of water and irrigating forests of growing trees. I did the stuff. Now, what you may not realize is that he is bragging in the highest possible way you could brag in that culture at that time. Because if you go back, if you're in your mind, all the way back to Genesis 1, 2, 3. And what do we see there? God plants a garden in Eden. In the minds of the ancient Middle East, or the Near Middle East, as we call it, the gods planted gardens. And we're not talking about Yahweh, but all of the cultures around them. Baal would have a garden, and Ashtoreth would have a garden. I mean, this is because you only planted gardens, and I'm not talking about rows of beans and radishes. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about luxurious places where lots of green things grew because there was more than ample water. Because they lived in a land that maybe wasn't necessarily occupied with lots and lots of water. They weren't living in a rainforest. I don't know if you've noticed, but the Middle East is still today somewhat arid. That's not new. It's always kind of been that way. And so in their mind, if you had the cash, so to speak, to have ponds of water, in fact, enough water to irrigate a forest full of trees, not only were you wealthy, buddy, but you made wealthy people look poor. In other words, I had all the stuff that anybody that wanted stuff could want. And I had more than that. I had all of the water, all of the fruit trees, I had ponds of water, all of these things. Can I find joy at the end of a hard day's work? How about that? So in verse 4, he goes big time. Doing all the stuff. He builds houses. That's a plural, by the way. Most of us have one. Somebody might have 2 or 10, but he built houses, whatever it is. So, He's just speaking about the extravagance and the luxury that he surrounded himself with. This is where we talk about having, gold toilets and gold plates and gold tables and gold coated, whatever, and a golden wheelchair. And then he says, in addition to being crazy wealthy and extravagantly living, he hires his own choirs. Now, usually in the temple, it was all male choirs. He has his male and female singers. So he's built himself some bands to entertain him. So, in the day before they had radio, he had all the music he wanted. He didn't have to turn on Netflix and try to figure out if there was anything worth watching. He just would call in the bands and say, I want some music. And they said, what kind do you want, sir? And tonight he wanted hard rock. The night before he wanted jazz. And he got it. He got the bands that he wanted. And if he wanted another band, he went and built one. I'm looking for some punk polka. Can we have some punk polka? And they would come in with the punk polka machine. Does that exist? Please don't tell me it exists. I do not want to know. I'll bet it does, and that makes me sad. Now I can't get that out of my head. Punk polka, it's going to be my thing. His hedonism then takes a physical turn. All the sex he could possibly want. Now, this kind of keys up on Solomon. King Solomon is famously known for having 700 wives and 300 concubines. And I don't know, and I think that's one of the reasons why, a lot of us think we read this and we think, well, we're talking about Solomon. Whether or not this is actually Solomon, we're talking about Solomon. And it probably is, but, whatever. And so he has amassed everything you could possibly amass in the pleasure department. Not only does he have all 600 channels of cable with nothing on, but he has all of the Netflix and all of the Hulu and all of the whatever else. I don't even know what the rest of these things are. He has all of it. The plethora of pleasure. And it leaves him more empty than when he began. In verse 10 he says this, all that my eyes desired, I did not refuse them. Now, if we're honest with ourselves, we're a little jealous. Just a little. And he says, my heart was pleased because of all my labor. This was my reward for all my labor. Now, this is where I would expect, believing that, the God of the Bible doesn't want us to have fun and he's a bad guy. He's just giving us all these rules to keep us from having all the fun that we want to have. I would think that this is where the Bible would go lecturing us about how Koheleth did all this stuff and he didn't really enjoy it. I actually had people tell me that when I was a teenager doing stupid things. You're not really having fun. They were wrong. I was having fun. It runs out. That's Koheleth's problem. It ran out. He's not denying the reality that these things were pleasurable. I sought pleasure and I got it. He doesn't want us thinking that I sought pleasure and didn't find it. Because we'd all be thinking, you know what? I'll bet I could do better. No, he's saying, I sought pleasure, and buddy, I found it. And it was empty too. It's like this scene in the movie Cars. You guys remember Cars? Love this scene. Little red car wants to be the top race car, and he's talking to the old race car was the top race car, and Doc Hudson, and they're racing for the Piston Cup. And he goes into the garage and he accidentally sees that Doc Hudson has not just one, but several of them all lined up on the shelf, just filled with dust. And he's amazed and he starts talking to him about it. Doc Hudson finally tells him, it's just an empty cup. He says, I got it. And it was empty. Like Koheleth, right there on the Disney screen. Pixar got it. Chasing satisfaction and all the pleasures we can muster is like chasing the wind, he says. Run all you want. You'll never catch it. Wrap your arms around it and squeeze. It's gone before you finish. That's why no matter how much you own, there's always one more gadget you need. And in the end, he says, there is no profit in these things under the sun. And key in on that phrase, under the sun. Because in that phrase, under the sun, it's noted that he's talking about stuff that's on the planet. So by virtue of that, he is excluding the stuff of God. There's no profit under the sun. So he disallows the quest for eternal value from interacting with God, and yet time after time, he has to come face to face with a life without God being entirely meaningless. He says, so what about the mind? I like to play with my brain. I like to have things, to learn things. I like to understand the way the world works. And so, verses 12 to 17, quickly he turns to the playground of the mind. He says, if sensuality isn't the answer, maybe degrees and intellectual pursuits will do. I will watch all of the TED Talks on YouTube and learn about everything. One of his chief concerns becomes that successive generations won't be able to accomplish more than what he has accomplished. And you think, well, why is that a big deal? He's just telling us that in terms of all of the pursuits, whether it was physical pleasure pursuits, or whether it was intellectual pursuits, or whether it was the pursuit of property, I did it all. I attained it all. Nobody is ever going to be able to top me. I got everything in the cabinet, and it was all empty. In fact, we're tempted at this point as we read through the book of Ecclesiastes to try and temper our own pain, maybe to ease our own pain and console ourselves with the gospel. But we have to remember that Koheleth has intentionally chosen to live outside of God being an answer. Just like our society. God cannot be the answer. I reject that. It's what our society has said. Koheleth is not gospel-driven. He speaks for the unbeliever. He speaks for the worldly man without an eternal hope. For the perspective of Koheleth, life without God as an anchor is a virtue. But it's empty. And he says, death and the grave, they're inevitable. Life is hard, then you die. Life is short, then you die. So what's the point? Even if it's better, wisdom is better, he says, than folly. But what's the point? Because the wise guy dies, not like the negative wise guy. The wise person dies, and the fool dies. And in the end, nobody remembers either one of them. And there's a part of me that wants to say, well, somebody's going to remember them. I don't know. Have you watched this last year as statues of great people have been torn down and thrown in rivers? Were they perfect people? No. They were not perfect people because there are none. Did George Washington own slaves? Yes. Was that bad? Yes. Did he do great things for the country? Yeah. One example. There could be lots and lots more. In fact, one of the things that marked this summer was such an ignorance of those that have gone before that even statues that had been erected of people who were successful in eliminating the slave trade were thrown in the river. Why? Because nobody knew why they were there, and they just assumed it was bad. So no matter how great the works, no matter how wise the person, no matter how foolish the individual, their works will ultimately be for God. Encouraged yet? My goodness, Ecclesiastes is such an uplift. Well, let's move on because we're not suffering enough. How about labor? How about hard work? There is nothing as satisfying as working and then coming in at the end of the day, putting your feet up, having the iced tea and going, right? It just feels good. And Koheles says, it doesn't last. It doesn't have any ongoing sense of eternal satisfaction. Verse 18, he says, so I hate life. Notice he doesn't say, by the way, I hated my life. He doesn't say that. He hated life. He hated yours too. Because he's understanding the fact that once you separate God as any kind of an answer, you're left with nothing. You're left with vanity. And then he says, the great problem with constantly working for this paycheck that we all labor for is that somebody's going to get it when we die. And I have no way of knowing if he's going to be an idiot. He who dies with the most toys dies and gives them to somebody else who didn't do anything to deserve them. Whew, English is such a hard language. And we could say it's even worse, die without a will, and the government gets to decide what's going to happen to it. And we all know how good the government is at handling things, right? So, I mean, maybe this is an aside from Ecclesiastes, but if you don't have a will, get one, right? It's just a good idea. Koheles has offered us two routine thoughts, right? Everything is meaningless, and number two, there's no benefit in anything. And the third one he comes up with here in verse 19, and that is who knows? He's going to come up with this all the time. Who knows? There's nobody who really knows this stuff. Again, nobody who knows this stuff, if you take God and you shove him away. So Koheles has this very limited worldview to what happens only under the sun. He's not allowed to consider God as an answer. So who knows? The answer then is nobody. Because he's going to ask metaphysical questions that nobody knows. How do you know the future? Nobody does. And in verses 20 through 23, this spiral of misery goes down a little bit further. He says, therefore I completely despaired. Well, yeah, this is the natural result of finding out that everything you ever pursue has absolutely no foundational meaning, function, and lasting impact. It's like grasping smoke. He says it's downright evil. There is. He makes a moral assessment of it. To live in this world, and I think let's just grab a hold of what he's rejected. To live in this world without having God as a source, as an immovable post upon which everything else can be anchored, will ultimately leave us with an evil world. Surprise. Is it any wonder that we look outside of our window and we see so many things that are completely wrong? And that is because people choose to live outside of God. Somebody who takes a life under the sun approach to life without God must land, if they're intellectually honest, in misery. And he says, so I despaired. What does a man get for all of this? Later on in Ecclesiastes 5:12, he's going to observe that at least the working man sleeps well because he's worn out, right? That's his reward. He works until he's worn out and he sleeps good. I don't know, my back, But here, all he says is there's pain, grief, and exhaustion. Hardly a very good return for our pessimistic preacher. He says the misery of the working man is frustratingly ungraspable. This is the most depressing book I think I've ever read. And the reason it's so depressing is because he's seeking after life outside of the one thing that gives meaning to all of life, and that is God. So the conclusion, let's look at that real quick and try to be fast about it, verses 24 through 26. Here's the conclusion. In the end, says Koheles, God has given us the ability to eat, to drink, and to enjoy the goodness of our labor. He's not denying that the things that we experience and are having a good time with are actually having a good time. He's not denying that that's a reality. Good food is satisfying. That's a gift from God to be able to enjoy a good meal. To be able to drink. To be able to sleep. To be able to step back from a job that you've accomplished and say, oh man, that was hard, but I feel like I accomplished something. He said those are gifts from God. And ultimately, he says that's the only gift you're going to get. And he's not being inconsistent. He's arguing for a limited enjoyment. Why? Because ultimate satisfaction eludes him. You reject God from the mix, ultimate satisfaction is gone. But temporary satisfaction, at least it exists. Even if he has to acknowledge that that also comes from God. He says it's not the laughter, it's not the entertainment, it's not the sex, the alcohol, the wealth, the accumulation of money, the real estate, or the things. It's not even your job, whether you're an engineer, a mechanic, an accountant, a surgeon, preacher, or a broom pusher. God is the only one who can give you enjoyment in the midst of all of those things. Grudgingly, he admits that the very pleasure he decided to test out in verse 1 is only found at the end of the chapter in God. Pleasure. The word is there twice. So many think that God is a celestial killjoy. But the reality is that God has created the pleasures that all of these things involve. And he has created them to be found in him. He knows how it works. He understands, as the designer, how the mechanism is meant to be put together. And if we try to put the mechanism of life together without him, we're going to end up the same way some of my projects end up, with a bunch of leftover parts and things that don't necessarily work the way I thought they should. Ultimately, I don't think Heleth would like the answer, but I think the author of Ecclesiastes would. If we're not willing to open up the manual and figure this stuff out, we're going to find that our warranty is null and void.